In the final days of a brutal Pacific battle, a group of wounded Japanese nurses braced for the worst, until something happened they never imagined. Instead of walking past them, U.S. medics dropped to their knees and treated the enemy women before their own lightly wounded Marines. What those nurses witnessed that day shattered years of fear, propaganda, and expectation. Stay with me, this story deserves to be remembered. Like, subscribe, and let's begin. The island was small enough that most American soldiers couldn't find it on a map before the war. It was one of dozens scattered across the Pacific, lush on the surface but shaped by volcanic rock underneath, with cliffs that caught the wind and dense jungle that swallowed sound. To the average viewer today, it may seem like just another name among many. But in 1944, this overlooked island became the center of a violent struggle, and ultimately, the stage for one of the most unexpected acts of mercy of the entire Pacific War. American forces approached the island with caution. The intelligence reports were vague, but one detail was clear: the Japanese had dug in deep. They had fortified ridges, hidden supply tunnels beneath palm groves, and constructed medical stations close enough to the fighting that even nurses could hear every shell landing. Every serviceman in the U.S. landing force understood he was facing a determined enemy, one known for fighting to the last breath. But what many Americans did not fully grasp at the time was just how close to the front Japanese nurses were forced to work. They were not given the protective distance American nurses received behind the lines. Instead, many Japanese nurses worked in forward bunkers, barely shielded from artillery fire, tending to soldiers whose wounds reflected the brutal closeness of the combat around them. These women were young, many barely in their 20s, trained to serve their emperor, conditioned to believe that surrender was impossible, and taught from childhood that Americans were cruel, merciless, even inhuman. The island's terrain made everything worse. Thick vegetation limited visibility to a few yards. Slopes were steep, uneven, and slick with humidity. Supply paths vanished under roots and vines. Medics on both sides faced constant exhaustion and dehydration. Every wounded soldier, whether Japanese or American, represented a logistical nightmare: how to move them, where to treat them, and how to keep them alive long enough to reach proper care. For American forces, this operation was part of the larger island-hopping strategy, targeting airfields, cutting Japanese supply lines, and forcing the enemy into smaller, weaker pockets. Each island captured meant fewer Japanese aircraft threatening American ships and fewer troops available to reinforce the next line of defense. But while the strategy was straightforward on paper, the reality on the ground was a grinding experience of mud, heat, and relentless resistance. As the U.S. Marines pushed deeper inland, they encountered positions that were both chaotic and strangely quiet, abandoned by Japanese units that had been shattered, their survivors scattered and desperate. Amid this confusion, reports began circulating of wounded Japanese personnel left behind, including nurses who had been working in underground treatment caves. Some had tried to flee, others stayed with their patients until it was impossible to continue. American medics were accustomed to danger, but they were also bound to a clear principle: treat the worst bleeding first. The more severe the injury, the faster they moved. This rule guided them through every campaign, every landing, every moment when chaos threatened discipline. It was a principle that made U.S. medical units some of the most respected in the world. Yet none of them expected what they were about to find on this small island. As the Marines tightened their lines and Corpsmen followed behind them, clearing the battlefield of wounded men, they discovered a cluster of Japanese nurses lying in a shallow depression near a collapsed bunker. Some were conscious. Others weren't. Their uniforms were torn and blood-soaked. They expected death, whether from enemy fire or their own military code. Instead, they looked up and saw something they could not have imagined: American medics moving toward them, not with weapons drawn, but with bandages, morphine, and stretchers. And in that quiet, humid clearing, the moral center of the story began to take shape, an event that would challenge everything those nurses had been told about their enemy. Long before American boots touched the island's sand, the lives of Japanese nurses had already been shaped by years of military discipline, cultural expectation, and wartime propaganda. These women were not simply medical workers, they were extensions of the imperial war machine, trained to serve without question and to place duty above all else. Their world was defined by obedience, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief in the righteousness of their nation's struggle. Many of these nurses came from families with deep patriotic roots. Some had brothers fighting in China, others had fathers lost at sea, and nearly all had been raised hearing that dying for the emperor was the highest honor imaginable. As children, they were told stories of Western cruelty, tales exaggerated to harden their hearts and eliminate hesitation. By the time they entered military nursing schools, those stories had crystallized into something close to fear. The physical training was demanding. Nurses practiced moving the wounded through smoke-filled corridors, tending to burns, handling broken limbs, and performing emergency procedures with minimal supplies. Instructors reminded them daily that resources would run out, conditions would worsen, and casualties would overwhelm them. They were told to work in caves, bunkers, or makeshift shelters under fire. They were warned that Americans would show no mercy. That belief shaped every expectation they carried into the Pacific. Once deployed to the island, reality hit them with full force. Supplies dwindled quickly. Antiseptic, bandages, morphine, and clean water all became scarce. Their treatment caves were carved into volcanic rock and barely ventilated. Lamps flickered constantly, and the air was thick with humidity and the metallic smell of blood. Nurses often worked for 20 hours at a stretch, moving from patient to patient in an endless loop of pain and desperation. Wounded soldiers arrived in waves, sometimes 6 at a time, sometimes dozens. Some were blinded. Others were missing limbs. Many were barely hanging on. The nurses did everything they could, but deep down, they knew the truth: they were being asked to stem a tide no one could stop. What made their situation uniquely tragic was how closely their medical stations were placed to the front lines. Japanese command believed that keeping medical units near the fighting would help soldiers maintain morale and encourage them to stand their ground. But as American forces advanced with overwhelming strength, these frontline positions became death traps. Nurses were expected to treat wounded men under the sound of American artillery and the echo of machine gun fire. Sometimes the ground shook so violently that medical tools rolled across the floor. Food became a luxury. Water was rationed to a few sips per person. Some nurses collapsed from exhaustion and had to be lifted onto makeshift cots before returning to work hours later. They comforted dying soldiers, bandaged burns, whispered prayers, and tried to maintain a sense of order in conditions that would have broken most civilians. All the while, they carried the weight of their indoctrination. They believed that surrender meant torture. They believed that Americans would never spare them. They believed that if captured, they would suffer fates worse than death. And so, many prepared themselves mentally for the only option they saw as honorable: to die alongside their patients if capture became inevitable. As the battle turned against Japan, the island's defensive network collapsed. Units were wiped out in minutes. Communications broke down. Some wounded soldiers lay in trenches for hours calling for help that would never arrive. The nurses were ordered to retreat deeper into the interior, carrying what medical supplies they could, but enemy fire closed off every escape route. For the first time since arriving, the nurses felt fear, not of Americans, but of abandonment. They realized they were no longer part of a functioning military force. They were isolated, exhausted, and running out of time. By the third day of continuous combat, some nurses had already been wounded themselves. Shrapnel cuts, burns, and concussions became common. Their once crisp uniforms were stained with dust, blood, and sweat. What remained of their medical station was little more than a shattered cave. Its entrance collapsed, leaving only a small gap of sunlight where dust drifted like falling ash. They knew capture was coming. They prepared for death. Some whispered final prayers. Others clutched the amulets their families had given them. But none expected what was about to happen next. They had been taught all their lives that Americans would walk past them, mock them, or kill them. Yet in the hours ahead, those beliefs would be challenged in a way that neither military training nor propaganda had prepared them to understand. When American forces advanced across the Pacific, they carried with them more than rifles and ammunition. They brought an entire medical system, organized, disciplined, and refined through years of battlefield experience. Long before they reached this island, U.S. Navy corpsmen and Army medics had treated casualties in jungles, beaches, coral reefs, and mountains. They knew what chaos looked like, and they knew how to keep their heads steady when others lost theirs. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, American medics did not operate under the belief that nationality defined worth. Their guiding principle was simple: the worst bleeding gets treated first. This was not a slogan, it was a doctrine. It meant that in the heat of battle, a medic ignored uniforms and focused on pulse, breathing, and blood loss. Whether the wounded man wore American khaki, Japanese olive brown, or no uniform at all did not matter. Severity came first. Humanity came first. This system made U.S. medical personnel some of the most respected figures among frontline troops. Marines often said they would follow a corpsman anywhere. Soldiers trusted their medics as much as their officers. These men were not armed with heavy weapons, yet they moved through the battlefield with incredible bravery, crawling forward under fire to save lives that seemed unsalvageable. Their training reinforced this courage. American medics practiced dragging casualties across open ground, applying tourniquets in darkness, performing needle decompressions, stitching wounds with trembling hands, and improvising treatments when supplies ran low. They learned how to treat burns from exploding fuel tanks, shrapnel wounds from mortars, and fractures caused by collapsing bunkers. They memorized the signs of shock, dehydration, and infection. And they learned to triage quickly, sometimes deciding in moments who could be saved and who could not. Their equipment was superior as well. Even on the toughest campaigns, U.S. medical units possessed better access to sulfa drugs, plasma, bandages, morphine, and clean water. Field hospitals were set up with efficiency. Aid stations were mapped in advance. Casualty evacuation routes were organized so that wounded men could reach surgeons faster than almost any other fighting force of the era. When American medics arrived on this small Pacific island, they entered a scene of devastation they had witnessed many times before, but with a twist they did not yet know was coming. The jungle was alive with distant gunfire, and smoke drifted between the trees. Marines were still engaging pockets of resistance, but the lines had pushed far enough inland that Corpsmen began sweeping the battlefield for survivors. This moment, this quiet pause between bursts of combat, was when the true strength of the American medical machine revealed itself. They moved in teams, each with a pattern honed by repetition. One corpsman scanned for movement. Another checked pulses. A third carried stretchers. They marked the dead, stabilized the living, and shouted for litter bearers when they found someone who needed urgent help. Even as heat pressed against their uniforms and sweat ran into their eyes, they worked with methodical calm. They treated fellow Marines with practiced speed, but they also treated wounded Japanese soldiers without hesitation. Some enemy troops were dazed, others terrified, most unable to comprehend why their enemy, whom they had been told was monstrous, was kneeling beside them with a canteen and a bandage. For American medics, it was simply what they were trained to do. But nothing could prepare them for what lay just ahead. As the Marines expanded their perimeter, Corpsmen discovered abandoned Japanese medical stations, collapsed caves, destroyed supply caches, broken stretchers. The signs were unmistakable: nurses had been here. The bloodstains, the medical cloths, the scattered tools told a story of frantic work and sudden retreat. Some corpsmen muttered quietly, knowing that Japanese units often chose death over capture. They expected to find bodies, not survivors. Yet the deeper they walked, the more they sensed something unfamiliar, an uneasy stillness, as though the jungle was holding its breath. Then they saw the depression in the ground, barely visible through the brush. A cluster of figures lay motionless. Uniforms torn. Hair matted with dust. Limbs twisted in exhaustion and pain. They approached cautiously, unsure whether the wounded might still resist. When they realized these were nurses, young women, some barely breathing, their instincts overrode all hesitation. The triage rules activated instantly. The nurses were in worse shape than the lightly wounded Marines nearby. Their blood loss was severe. Their pulses were faint. Their breathing uneven. Without rapid stabilization, they would die within minutes. And so, in that humid clearing, the American medical machine made its decision, not based on politics, not based on nationality, but based entirely on the science of triage. The worst bleeding came first. American medics knelt beside Japanese nurses and began saving lives that had been taught to fear them. In this moment, the island's battle faded into the background. What mattered now was life, death, and the duty every American corpsman carried with unwavering conviction. The clearing where the Japanese nurses lay wounded was not a place anyone would have chosen to make a stand. It was a shallow dip in the earth, carved by years of rain runoff, half covered by vines and shadowed by leaning palms. The Marines who first passed it barely noticed it in the rush to secure the next ridge. But for the American corpsmen following behind, the shape of the ground meant something else, a natural pocket where wounded often crawled or fell during a retreat. The jungle around them was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No birds. No insects. Only the distant thud of artillery and the occasional crack of small arms fire. The battle was still active, but this small corner of the island felt paused, caught between the chaos of war and the fragile stillness that follows it. Corpsmen John Mitchell and Robert Hale stepped carefully into the depression, expecting to find another Marine who'd been separated from his squad or a wounded Japanese rifleman who might still be able to resist. Instead, they were met by a scene that made both men halt. 7 Japanese nurses lay scattered in the grass, their uniforms torn, their hair tangled, their bodies bruised and bleeding. Some were conscious, staring up with glassy eyes full of fear and disbelief. Others drifted between awareness and darkness, murmuring weakly or barely breathing at all. Their medical satchels were empty, their bandages used, their supplies depleted. Whatever they had endured, it had already consumed their strength. For a moment, both corpsmen simply stood there, absorbing the shock of seeing enemy medical personnel this close to the front. They had read intelligence reports about Japanese nurses being deployed near frontline caves, but seeing them in this broken state, exhausted, frightened, and clearly abandoned, was something neither man had expected. Mitchell knelt first. His training kicked in before conscious thought could interfere. He checked pulses, breathing, responsiveness. Hale joined him seconds later, pulling medical gear from his pack. Neither man discussed what they were seeing. They didn't need to. The triage assessment was immediate and unmistakable. Several of these women were in critical condition. Within moments, more Corpsmen arrived. Marines secured the perimeter, scanning the jungle for any sign of enemy stragglers who might attempt a last-ditch attack. The nurses watched, stunned, as American boots circled them, not in hostility, but in protection. For women who had been taught all their lives that Americans would kill them on sight, this alone was almost impossible to comprehend. The Corpsmen worked fast and with quiet focus. One stabilized a leg wound, applying a pressure bandage with practiced hands. Another raised a nurse's chin and checked her airway. A third started preparing plasma, knowing it could mean the difference between life and death in cases of severe blood loss. The American approach was methodical, efficient, and grounded in compassion. These medics had been taught to treat any wounded person they encountered, even if that person had been the enemy minutes earlier. But for the Japanese nurses, the emotional collision was overwhelming. They had crawled into the depression believing it was where they would die. Their own soldiers had been forced to abandon them during the chaos of the retreat. Their leaders had drilled into them since childhood that Americans were ruthless, barbaric, and devoid of humanity. That belief had been their frightening reality, until now. Some nurses tried to pull away at first, expecting harm. Others cried softly, unable to reconcile the scene unfolding before them. One young nurse, barely 20, stared at the American Corpsman treating her arm as though witnessing something beyond comprehension. Another clutched the collar of her torn uniform, trembling as she realized the medic was shielding her from the sun with his own canteen cloth. Amid this tension, one fact became clear: the Americans were not treating them as enemies. They were treating them as patients. The Corpsmen continued their work even as the battle rumbled in the distance. They called for stretchers, coordinated evacuation movements, and documented injuries for transport. Every action they took reinforced the same truth: these women mattered to them as human beings first, adversaries second. It was in this collision of expectations and reality, fear and mercy, that the emotional core of the story deepened. The nurses' world had been built on propaganda. The Americans' world was built on principles. And in that quiet corner of the battlefield, those two worlds met, not through gunfire, but through the steady hands of U.S. medics. For the Japanese nurses lying in that shallow depression, the minutes that followed felt unreal. Their entire lives had been shaped by a single message: Americans will never show mercy. It was repeated in schools, printed in newspapers, spoken in military training halls, and reinforced through endless wartime broadcasts. They were told American troops would mutilate prisoners, kill women first, and leave the wounded to die slowly. These warnings were not merely propaganda, they were psychological conditioning. But nothing in their upbringing prepared them for what happened next. American Corpsmen did not look at these nurses with anger or contempt. They saw trauma, shock, and severe blood loss. One nurse had a deep shrapnel wound running along her thigh. Another suffered burns across her shoulder. A third had passed out from dehydration. These conditions meant one thing in U.S. medical doctrine: critical priority. Nearby Marines had their own minor wounds: cuts from coral, splinters from wooden defenses, bruises from stray fragments. Under normal circumstances, these would still receive quick attention. Yet in this moment, even the Marines stepped back, understanding exactly what the Corpsmen were doing. Combat medics were trained to treat the most life-threatening injuries immediately, regardless of uniform. The doctrine was so ingrained that no one questioned it. This is where the shock truly began. The Japanese nurses watched as American medics bypassed their own lightly injured troops and clustered around them. They watched as American hands carefully lifted their arms, checked their pulses, bandaged their wounds, and administered plasma. They watched as water was pressed to their lips, clean water, precious water, given freely with no hesitation. And they watched as Marines created a protective perimeter, ensuring no stray enemy fire could reach the women on the ground. For the nurses, this was not kindness. It was a revelation. One nurse, older than the rest, tried weakly to sit up when she realized an American Corpsman was tying a tourniquet on her leg. Her voice was hoarse. She believed he was preparing her for execution. But when he spoke, not words, just a calm easy easy meant to reassure, she froze. She understood the tone, even if she didn't understand the language. It was the same tone she had used countless times with her own patients. It was the tone of a caregiver, not an executioner. Another nurse felt a medic's gloved hand beneath her head as he raised her chin to clear her airway. For a moment she panicked, thinking he might harm her. But when he gently tilted her head and wiped blood from her cheek, the fear dissolved into confusion. She struggled to understand why a man she had been taught to hate was treating her with more compassion than some of her own commanders ever had. The youngest of the group, barely 18, lay trembling as a corpsman wrapped her arm. Tears streamed down her face, not from pain but from overwhelming disbelief. She had spent her entire life hearing that Americans were beasts. Yet here they were, saving her life. American medics, for their part, kept working. They moved with the same deliberate precision they used on every battlefield. One monitored breathing. Another started plasma. A third applied sulfa powder to prevent infection. Their hands were steady, their eyes focused, their minds trained to block out everything except the vital signs in front of them. To them, this was not an act of mercy or strategy, it was simply their duty. But for the nurses, the emotional impact was profound. They watched Marines aid the wounded, not with aggression but with gentle certainty. They saw men who moments earlier had been in combat now carrying stretchers through rough terrain, making sure not to jostle their fragile bodies. They saw discipline and humanity blended into a single force. They saw, perhaps for the first time, what American soldiers truly represented. As the medics worked, word spread through nearby Japanese stragglers who were hiding in the brush, watching from the shadows. Some of them had rifles trained on the Americans, unsure whether to fire or flee. But when they saw the scene, their own nurses being lifted onto American stretchers and treated with care, they hesitated. This hesitation would ripple far beyond the battlefield in the hours to come. For now, however, the nurses could only lie still as American medics gave them a gift they had never expected, a chance to live. The jungle around them remained silent, but inside the minds of those women, a lifetime of fear began to fracture. And that fracture would soon widen into something even more powerful, a shift that reached deep into the hearts of surviving Japanese troops. News travels strangely on a battlefield. Sometimes it moves by rumor, carried on whispers from one foxhole to another. Other times it spreads in silence, seen through the leaves by eyes too frightened to blink. On this island, the story of what the American medics did began to move long before the stretchers reached the Marine aid station. Japanese stragglers, groups of 3, 4, sometimes only one, were scattered across the jungle. Many were wounded, dehydrated, or half delirious. Others were hiding in the brush, rifles laid across their laps, unsure whether to fight or surrender. When they saw the Americans tending to the nurses, confusion hit them like a wave. These soldiers had been fed the same propaganda as the nurses. They had been told that Americans killed prisoners on sight. They'd been promised that surrender would bring torture, humiliation, or worse. And for years, they had believed every word. Japanese military leaders relied heavily on fear, because fear kept their troops from giving up even when defeat was certain. But what those hidden soldiers saw on that afternoon did not match anything they had been told. They watched American corpsmen bend over the wounded nurses, not with mockery, but with concern. They saw Marines setting aside their own injuries so the nurses could receive care first. They saw stretchers carried gently, bodies shielded from the sun, water offered to parched lips, and hands lifting those women as if they were their own. It was more than a surprise, it was a shock to the core of their worldview. Several Japanese soldiers, weak and trembling from their own wounds, lowered their rifles. One leaned his head against a tree, whispering to himself, trying to reconcile the scene with everything he had been taught. Another watched as the medics moved deeper into the clearing and muttered, "They are saving them, even them," as if speaking the words might make them easier to believe. Moments like this have been documented throughout the Pacific War, rare moments when mercy pierced through layers of indoctrination. And each time it happened, it left a profound impact on morale. This island was no different. Reports from American patrols later described something unusual. More Japanese soldiers began surrendering in the hours that followed. Some emerged from brush with hands raised. Others crawled forward, unable to walk. A few simply lay down their rifles and waited to be found. These were not mass surrenders. Japanese doctrine still held tight over many, but the number was enough to be noted. One Marine corporal later wrote in a report that the Japanese seemed less certain of what they believed about us after that day. Another observed that prisoners appeared calmer, more resigned, almost relieved. It wasn't that the war suddenly softened, there were still moments of brutal resistance. But in this corner of the island, something had changed. The nurses themselves, though drifting in and out of consciousness, sensed the shift too. They were no longer surrounded by terror. Instead, they found themselves being carried through the jungle by men who treated them with the same professionalism they offered to their own wounded. These small gestures, clean bandages, water, shaded stretchers, became powerful symbols. And for the Japanese soldiers who witnessed them, these symbols shattered the wall of propaganda brick by brick. In war, morale can collapse for many reasons: hunger, exhaustion, hopelessness. But sometimes, surprisingly, it collapses because the enemy shows a kind of humanity that commanders had insisted did not exist. That is what happened here. Not through firepower. Not through intimidation. But through mercy. As American medics continued their work, the quiet ripples of their actions spread outward, touching men who had never imagined they would see compassion from those they fought against. And these ripples would continue long after the stretchers disappeared into the trees, shaping testimonies, post-war memories, and the emotional landscape of the soldiers who survived. News travels strangely on a battlefield. Sometimes it moves by rumor, carried on whispers from one foxhole to another. Other times it spreads in silence, seen through the leaves by eyes too frightened to blink. On this island, the story of what the American medics did began to move long before the stretchers reached the Marine aid station. Japanese stragglers, groups of 3, 4, sometimes only one, were scattered across the jungle. Many were wounded, dehydrated, or half delirious. Others were hiding in the brush, rifles laid across their laps, unsure whether to fight or surrender. When they saw the Americans tending to the nurses, confusion hit them like a wave. These soldiers had been fed the same propaganda as the nurses. They had been told that Americans killed prisoners on sight. They'd been promised that surrender would bring torture, humiliation, or worse. And for years, they had believed every word. Japanese military leaders relied heavily on fear, because fear kept their troops from giving up even when defeat was certain. But what those hidden soldiers saw on that afternoon did not match anything they had been told. They watched American corpsmen bend over the wounded nurses, not with mockery, but with concern. They saw Marines setting aside their own injuries so the nurses could receive care first. They saw stretchers carried gently, bodies shielded from the sun, water offered to parched lips, and hands lifting those women as if they were their own. It was more than a surprise, it was a shock to the core of their worldview. Several Japanese soldiers, weak and trembling from their own wounds, lowered their rifles. One leaned his head against a tree, whispering to himself, trying to reconcile the scene with everything he had been taught. Another watched as the medics moved deeper into the clearing and muttered, "They are saving them, even them," as if speaking the words might make them easier to believe. Moments like this have been documented throughout the Pacific War, rare moments when mercy pierced through layers of indoctrination. And each time it happened, it left a profound impact on morale. This island was no different. Reports from American patrols later described something unusual. More Japanese soldiers began surrendering in the hours that followed. Some emerged from brush with hands raised. Others crawled forward, unable to walk. A few simply lay down their rifles and waited to be found. These were not mass surrenders. Japanese doctrine still held tight over many, but the number was enough to be noted. One Marine corporal later wrote in a report that the Japanese seemed less certain of what they believed about us after that day. Another observed that prisoners appeared calmer, more resigned, almost relieved. It wasn't that the war suddenly softened, there were still moments of brutal resistance. But in this corner of the island, something had changed. The nurses themselves, though drifting in and out of consciousness, sensed the shift too. They were no longer surrounded by terror. Instead, they found themselves being carried through the jungle by men who treated them with the same professionalism they offered to their own wounded. These small gestures, clean bandages, water, shaded stretchers, became powerful symbols. And for the Japanese soldiers who witnessed them, these symbols shattered the wall of propaganda brick by brick. In war, morale can collapse for many reasons: hunger, exhaustion, hopelessness. But sometimes, surprisingly, it collapses because the enemy shows a kind of humanity that commanders had insisted did not exist. That is what happened here. Not through firepower. Not through intimidation. But through mercy. As American medics continued their work, the quiet ripples of their actions spread outward, touching men who had never imagined they would see compassion from those they fought against. And these ripples would continue long after the stretchers disappeared into the trees, shaping testimonies, post-war memories, and the emotional landscape of the soldiers who survived.